Christmas Eve, 1634, brought snow to Vienna that fell thick and silent over the Hofburg Palace. Inside the royal chambers, a young woman had just given birth to a daughter. The room smelled of blood, sweat, and the incense that priests burned to ward off evil spirits. Servants moved quietly through candlelight, changing soiled linens and whispering prayers. The newborn girl cried weakly, her face red from the struggle of entering the world. To the courtiers assembled in the antechamber, she was simply another princess in a dynasty that had produced dozens of them. But this infant was different in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent for years. Her name was Mariana of Austria, and the blood flowing through her tiny body was so tangled by generations of incestuous marriages that she would become the most inbred queen in European history. The baby's father was Ferdinand III, who would soon become Holy Roman Emperor. Her mother was Mariana of Spain, and here's where things got complicated. Mariana wasn't just Ferdinand's wife. She was also his cousin and his niece through multiple overlapping branches of the Hapsburg family tree. This wasn't an accident or a scandal. This was deliberate policy. For 3 centuries, the Hapsburg dynasty had pursued an obsession with keeping their empire intact by refusing to marry outside the family. They wed their nieces, their cousins, their uncles, repeating the same combinations generation after generation until their family tree stopped looking like a tree and started resembling a tightly wound knot that was slowly strangling itself. Even in the candlelit birthing chamber, careful observers could see hints of what this breeding policy had produced. The infant's jaw was slightly too heavy for a newborn. Her lips were soft but already shaped in that distinctive protrusion that marked every Hapsburg. The doctors and priests who examined her murmured prayers of thanksgiving that she'd survived the birth at all, because Hapsburg babies died with alarming frequency. Some were born with skulls full of fluid that would kill them within days. Others emerged with twisted spines or organs that didn't function properly. The lucky ones, like Mariana, survived infancy but carried visible markers of their corrupted bloodline in the shape of their faces and the weakness of their constitutions. The Hapsburg strategy seemed logical from a certain perspective. By marrying within the family, they kept their territories consolidated. Every wedding was also a political treaty, ensuring that land and power stayed under Hapsburg control. Other European dynasties looked outward for alliances, marrying French princesses or English nobles, creating complex webs of international relationships. The Hapsburgs turned inward instead, creating a closed loop where the same blood circulated through the same bodies generation after generation. They believed they were preserving purity. What they were actually doing was concentrating genetic defects until they became impossible to ignore. By the time Mariana was born, the Hapsburg gene pool had become so restricted that modern geneticists estimate her inbreeding coefficient was higher than what you'd find in small isolated villages. Where normal Europeans of the 17th century had parents with virtually no shared ancestry, Mariana's parents were as closely related as uncle and niece. This meant she inherited the same harmful genes from both sides of her family, doubling and tripling the impact of genetic problems that should have been diluted by fresh bloodlines. The consequences showed up in every generation: high infant mortality, frequent miscarriages, children who survived but developed slowly or suffered from mysterious illnesses. And always, that distinctive Hapsburg jaw, growing more pronounced with each generation as the family bred closer and closer. Mariana's childhood in Vienna was spent in gilded nurseries surrounded by the ghosts of siblings and cousins who hadn't made it past infancy. Death was so common in Hapsburg families that it barely registered as tragedy anymore. Another baby born, another tiny coffin carried through palace corridors, another discreet burial with official records that blamed natural causes or God's will. Nobody wanted to admit that the dynasty's breeding policy was producing children too weak to survive. That would mean acknowledging that their strategy of preserving power through incestuous marriages was actually destroying them from within. So they maintained the fiction that Hapsburg blood was divine and special, even as their babies died and their surviving children showed increasingly obvious signs of physical deterioration. Growing up in the Hapsburg court meant learning early that appearances mattered more than reality. Mariana was raised knowing she wasn't really a person. She was a political asset, a womb that would eventually produce heirs to continue the dynasty. Her education focused on languages, religious devotion, and the elaborate etiquette that governed every moment of aristocratic life. She learned to sit perfectly still for hours during ceremonies. She learned to smile at precisely the right moments and bow at exactly the correct angles. She learned that her body belonged not to herself but to the empire, and that her primary function was to marry whoever would best serve Hapsburg interests. By the time she was a teenager, her fate had already been decided. She was betrothed to her uncle Philip IV of Spain, a man nearly 3 decades older than her. This wasn't unusual by Habsburg standards. Philip II had married his own niece. Philip III had married his cousin. Now Philip IV would marry Mariana, continuing the pattern of uncle-niece unions that had become standard Habsburg practice. The family saw nothing wrong with this. They believed that marrying within the bloodline preserved their divine right to rule. They didn't understand or care that every incestuous marriage added another layer of genetic damage, another generation of weakened children, another step closer to the biological collapse that would eventually destroy them. The wedding was arranged through proxy ceremony in Vienna. Mariana, barely 15 years old, stood before an altar in silver brocade so heavy it dragged on the stone floor. A Spanish ambassador spoke Philip's vows for him while the teenage bride repeated words she'd memorized but probably didn't fully comprehend. She was binding herself to a man she'd never met, committing to leave her home and travel across the Alps to a foreign court where everything from the language to the customs would be strange and hostile. The Austrian courtiers celebrated the match as a triumph of dynastic unity. Behind their smiles was the cold calculation of empire. 2 Habsburg branches, Austria and Spain, joined once again through marriage. The genetic noose tightened another notch. The journey to Spain was long and brutal. Mariana traveled in heavy carriages that creaked under the weight of her dowry and trousseau. The route wound through mountain passes and across plains, taking weeks to complete. She watched the landscape change from Austrian mountains to Spanish plateaus, each mile taking her further from everything familiar. When she finally reached Madrid, her Austrian servants were dismissed and replaced by Spanish attendants who bowed deeply but watched her with cold, appraising eyes. To them, she wasn't Mariana the girl. She was the queen, a vessel into which Spain's hopes for an heir would be poured. And those hopes were desperate, because Philip's previous children had all died young or proven too weak to rule effectively. The Spanish court was even more rigid than Vienna. Queens were treated less like wives than like sacred relics, displayed behind layers of protocol and ceremony. Every step Mariana took was choreographed. Every word she spoke was measured. Even her prayers were supervised by confessors chosen by the king. The etiquette was suffocating. Where Vienna had allowed some movement and laughter, Madrid imposed silence and stillness. Mariana learned quickly that survival meant perfect obedience to rules that made no sense except as displays of power. She learned to bow at exact angles, to smile at precise moments, to mask any real emotion with the serene expression expected of queens. But the real test wasn't ceremonial. It was biological. Spain needed an heir. The entire empire watched Mariana's womb as closely as generals watched military campaigns. Her first pregnancy came quickly after the marriage. She was 16 years old, her body barely finished developing, and she was expected to produce a healthy son who could inherit the largest empire on earth. When she gave birth to a daughter in 1651, there was disappointment but also relief. The baby, Margaret Teresa, survived. She grew into a healthy child who would eventually marry Mariana's own brother, continuing the Habsburg pattern of incestuous unions. But daughters weren't enough. Spain needed a male heir, and Mariana's body would be pushed to its limits trying to provide one. The pregnancies came one after another through the 1650s, and each one took a visible toll on Mariana's health. She was still in her 20s but already looked older, her face growing pale and drawn, her body weakened by the constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. In 1655, she gave birth to another daughter, Maria Ambrosia. The baby lived for only a few months before dying of causes that official records vaguely described as natural frailty. The truth was more disturbing. The infant showed visible deformities from birth, features that marked her as a victim of her family's breeding practices. Courtiers whispered about abnormalities too delicate to record openly, about a baby who was doomed from the moment she drew her first breath. Then came Philip Prospero in 1657. A son. A prince. The answer to Spain's desperate prayers. For 4 brief years, hope radiated through the empire. Court painters depicted the boy as healthy and vigorous, creating portraits that glowed with legitimacy and promise. Celebrations were held across Spanish territories. The dynasty had produced a male heir who might actually survive to adulthood, but those hopes died with Philip Prospero in 1661. The boy's death was devastating not just personally but politically. Every citizen understood what the priests wouldn't say openly. The bloodline itself was collapsing. Another son, Ferdinand Thomas, was born in 1658 and died within a year. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Mariana's body was being destroyed by this endless cycle of pregnancy and loss. Each birth left her weaker. Each dead child added to the psychological burden she carried. But she couldn't stop trying. The empire demanded an heir. Her role as queen meant nothing if she couldn't produce a son who would inherit Spain's territories and continue Hapsburg rule. So she endured another pregnancy, another labor, another terrifying moment when the baby emerged and everyone held their breath waiting to see if it would survive. In 1661, she gave birth to another son. He lived. They named him Charles. And from the moment he drew his first breath, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Even in the cradle, Charles's body seemed twisted. His development was delayed. His jaw protruded too heavily for his small face, the Hapsburg jaw taken to its most extreme form yet. He couldn't nurse properly because his tongue was too large for his mouth. He couldn't hold his head up. He made strange sounds that suggested problems with his throat or palate. Nurses and confessors surrounded him with religious relics and charms, as though warding off a curse. They called him blessed. Others whispered that he was bewitched. The truth was simpler and more terrible. Charles was the product of too many generations of incestuous breeding. His body was a catalog of genetic defects accumulated over centuries of Habsburg marriages between close relatives. Mariana looked at her son and saw both victory and horror. He had survived when so many of her other children had died. But survival wasn't the same as health. Charles was alive, but he would never be normal. His twisted body and delayed development were visible proof of what the Habsburg breeding policy had produced. Every courtier who saw him understood the implications, even if nobody dared speak them aloud. The dynasty's obsession with keeping bloodlines pure had created a king who was physically incapable of fulfilling his role. And Mariana, who had sacrificed her health and endured years of agonizing pregnancies, had to watch her only surviving son struggle with a body that barely functioned. The cost wasn't just biological. It was personal. Mariana had lost children to the grave. She had endured pregnancies that ended in tears and faced the unbearable weight of public expectation. Her jaw had tightened over the years. Her features had aged before their time. The pale girl who had arrived in Madrid wearing silver brocade had transformed into a gaunt woman whose face showed the strain of everything she'd endured. But her will had grown stronger even as her body weakened. She couldn't afford to crumble. She was the Queen of Spain, and her survival meant the survival of Hapsburg power in the Spanish Empire, even if that power now rested on the crooked shoulders of a boy whose body already betrayed him. Philip IV died in 1665, leaving Mariana a widow at 31 and regent for a 4-year-old son who could barely walk. Charles was small, sickly, and marked by every visible sign of the Hapsburg genetic catastrophe. His jaw protruded so severely that he couldn't chew food properly. His tongue struggled to form words. His limbs seemed weak and his growth was stunted. Some whispered that he had been born less an heir than an omen, his twisted body the visible bill for centuries of incestuous marriages. Yet despite his obvious disabilities, he was king of the largest empire on earth. Spain's dominions stretched from Madrid to Mexico, from Naples to Manila. And all of it now depended on a child who trembled under the weight of prayers. Mariana stepped into the role of regent with unexpected strength. The girl who had been raised to be obedient and decorative revealed herself as a capable political operator. She met with the Council of State, signed decrees, appointed ministers, and defended Spain's interests against enemies who smelled weakness. But she faced resistance from the start. The Spanish nobility resented being ruled by a woman, especially a foreign woman. They called her the Austrian behind her back, emphasizing that she wasn't really Spanish, that she had no right to wield power in their kingdom. Some plotted openly to remove her from the regency and replace her with Don Juan of Austria the Younger, Philip's illegitimate son, who represented everything they wanted in a leader: male, Spanish-born, and military-minded. The political battles intensified through the late 1660s. Don Juan gathered support among nobles and within the church itself. Bishops declared that Mariana's influence was unholy, that foreign advisors were poisoning Spain's soul. Crowds gathered in Madrid's streets shouting for her downfall. Faced with the threat of civil war, Mariana made tactical retreats, sacrificing advisors to preserve her own position. She learned to smile while calculating, to speak in diplomatic code, to cloak threats in expressions of maternal devotion. She became a master of the political game, outmaneuvering rivals who underestimated her because she was female. But all her political skill couldn't change the fundamental problem. Charles wasn't getting better. If anything, his condition worsened as he grew. By his teenage years, the deformities that had been concerning in childhood became grotesque in adolescence. His jaw jutted forward so dramatically that his teeth couldn't align. Eating caused him agony. His spine curved abnormally. His legs couldn't support him without assistance. He suffered seizures that left him unconscious and confused. His speech was slurred and difficult to understand. Physicians bled him regularly, applied leeches, prescribed bizarre treatments based on medieval medical theory. Nothing helped because the problems weren't medical in any conventional sense. They were genetic, the accumulated result of generations of harmful mutations that had been concentrated rather than diluted by the Hapsburg breeding policy. The question everyone avoided asking became impossible to ignore as Charles reached adulthood. Could he produce an heir? His body was so damaged that fertility seemed unlikely, but Spain needed him to marry and father sons, or the entire Hapsburg line in Spain would end with him. In 1679, Mariana arranged his first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess who was young, healthy, and from a family known for fertility. She arrived in Madrid full of hope that new blood might somehow compensate for centuries of genetic damage. But months turned into years with no pregnancy. The court became a theater of desperation. Physicians examined both Charles and Marie-Louise repeatedly, looking for explanations for the failure to conceive. When Marie-Louise died in 1689 after a decade of childless marriage, there was public mourning but private relief. A new queen could be chosen. Another chance for an heir. Mariana, now in her 50s but still sharp politically, oversaw the selection of Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess from a notoriously fertile family. Her sisters had produced dozens of children. Surely she could give Spain an heir, even with Charles as damaged as he was. But Mariana discovered what Marie-Louise had learned. Charles wasn't capable of fathering children. His body was too broken, his reproductive system too compromised by genetic defects. The dynasty was finished, and everyone knew it except possibly Mariana herself, who clung to the hope that somehow, miraculously, her son might still produce an heir and save the Hapsburg line. Mariana of Austria died in 1696 at age 62, her body finally giving out after decades of stress and disappointment. She died believing her son might yet father an heir, clinging to hope even as European diplomats openly planned how to partition Spanish territories after Charles's inevitable death without issue. Her funeral was elaborate, a spectacle of black velvet and golden torches winding through Madrid's streets. Crowds lined the route remembering not the Austrian girl who had married her uncle, but the widow who had kept their empire together through force of will when collapse seemed certain. She was buried at El Escorial, the massive mausoleum built by Philip II, joining generations of Hapsburgs in their final resting place. Charles II outlived his mother by 4 years, dying in 1700 at age 38. His death marked the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. He had never produced an heir despite 2 marriages. His body, twisted by centuries of incestuous breeding, had proven incapable of the one function that mattered most. The autopsy performed after his death revealed the full extent of the damage. His body was described as not containing a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were putrefied. His head was full of water. Whether these descriptions were medically accurate or exaggerated doesn't really matter. What matters is that they captured the essential truth. Charles was physically ruined by his genetics, destroyed before he was born by the accumulated consequences of Habsburg breeding policy. The War of Spanish Succession that followed Charles's death reshaped European politics. The Spanish crown passed to the Bourbons of France, ending 3 centuries of Habsburg rule in Spain. The empire that Mariana had worked so hard to preserve was divided among foreign powers. All her political skill, all her determination, all the suffering she had endured through multiple pregnancies and dead children, none of it could overcome the fundamental biological reality. You cannot concentrate a gene pool indefinitely without consequences. Every uncle-niece marriage, every cousin union, every contract that tightened the family circle added another layer of genetic weakness. The Hapsburg dynasty had mistaken incest for strength, and it destroyed them. What then was Mariana's legacy? She was the most inbred queen in European history, with a genetic coefficient that would be considered horrifying even in isolated populations. Her parents were uncle and niece. She married her own uncle. She gave birth to children who carried double and triple doses of harmful genetic variants. One of those children was Charles II, whose body was so damaged by accumulated mutations that he became a symbol of dynastic collapse. Modern geneticists studying the Hapsburg family tree have identified the specific genetic problems that plagued them: mandibular prognathism, the protruding jaw that became their trademark; developmental delays and intellectual disabilities; fertility problems that grew worse with each generation; high infant mortality. All of these were consequences of inbreeding, and Mariana embodied them completely. But she was more than just her blood. She survived in a world designed to destroy her. She outlasted political rivals who tried to depose her. She governed an empire effectively during one of its most difficult periods. She maintained Spanish power and prestige even as the biological foundation of that power crumbled beneath her. She was both victim and perpetrator of the Habsburg experiment. Victim because she was born into a system that saw her only as a womb for continuing damaged bloodlines. Perpetrator because she participated willingly in that system, marrying her uncle and producing children who inherited concentrated genetic defects. She couldn't have changed the dynasty's breeding policy even if she'd understood the biological consequences. But she implemented it faithfully, and the cost was measured in tiny coffins and twisted bodies. History remembers Mariana of Austria as a warning about what happens when power becomes more important than biology. The Hapsburgs believed they could preserve their empire through strategic incest, keeping territories consolidated by refusing to marry outside the family. What they actually did was create a genetic catastrophe that destroyed them within a few generations. Mariana's life spanned the final decades of that catastrophe. She was born into it, married deeper into it, and produced the living symbol of its culmination in Charles II. The arithmetic of blood always balances eventually. In Mariana's lifetime, the numbers still added up barely. After her death, the equation collapsed completely. Spain lost not only its dynasty but its place as Europe's greatest power. And all of it can be traced back to a simple biological truth that the Habsburgs refused to acknowledge. You cannot breed parents and children, uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins for centuries without creating monsters.